Remember that opening where Ed took Ralph's chickens, seemingly for no reason, with no context given, and had them swimming around in his tub, and then they just suddenly leave on their own when Ralph gets there, and there's no real follow-up to that random opening? Well, knowing from inside sources, that was originally meant to be part of the whole plot of the episode. It was going to be a full special, and it was going to be a lot more dark than you expect from the network. I got to witness this. The episode starts out the same, however, we see Ed, through a montage, putting the chickens through many other exercises to train prepare them, as if they were getting ready for an Olympic event and becoming more strengthened and stronger. Ralph then eventually comes by and takes his chickens back. However, once we get back to his house, that's when we find out that they were just much too strong. To quote Ed, "They're trying to be the best chickens they can be." The chickens, seemingly being led by the one that's mentioned the most, Gertrude, begin to cooperate and band together to lead some sort of revolt. The chickens together flew at Ralph and start to swarm and attack him, and the surprise of it caught Ralph off guard and caused him to yell, "Shock-look-ah!" And the chickens were walking and clunking around, flying around Ralph and grabbing him with his talons and clawing his skin off, and they eventually began grabbing and slowly tearing his arms off, and you could hear the cracks of the bones come out, and blood was coming out, and Ralph started yelling, "Hey, Mama!" And Ralph tried to fight back, but the chickens, they proved to become too strong through Ed's rigorous training, and eventually they pulled off all of Ralph's limbs, and then they cut open his abdomen and started pulling off his guts and organs out, and it was unbelievably sickening and violent, and it looked almost too real to just be a part of a cartoon. And we cut back to Ed's basement, and he was talking about how well done the chickens are and how great they're doing and exactly what he wants, and as he spoke, there was an almost sexual undertone to his cadence. The chickens then flew up with Johnny, who was at the playground on the swing set, and they began pecking at his head, and he went like, "Oh," and his blood started coming off his head that looked hyper-realistic, and the chickens eventually flew off, and at this point, the sky and overall atmosphere and color overlay of the cul-de-sac began to look a lot more red. Saw Kevin and Naz together outside on the sidewalk, and the chickens, they flew over to Naz and Kevin said something about them being such a dork, and then he laughed while trying to walk off, poorly disguising how fearful and cowardly he was with the chickens, and he tries to escape by just, lightly walking it off and not running. That seemed like it could be fast enough to seem unsuspicious. However, the animation messed up, and his legs moved too slowly as Kevin's frame rate was way too slow, and he therefore could not escape from the chicken's wrath, and they completely swarmed him and started tearing him apart in a scuffle, and you could see blood flying out as Kevin screamed, and hyper-realistic blood was flying everywhere, and eventually he just let out once, "Dude," before being nothing but a pile of viscera and bones. The chickens then went after Naz, who was running away from them, but ultimately got caught, and they grabbed her by the hair, and she was like, "Ah!" And she was like, "This is so not cool, dude," as they started pulling her hair up and trying to tear off her scalp, her whole entire head with it. And I jumped from the surprise of it, but at this point the animation had entirely changed, to have them and the chickens just look like crudely put together 3D models. They were just very basic shapes that were barely together, and they were basically colored but not all textured and detailed, and it looked like something that a little kid would create in their first time using such a program. And it was like that where the chicken with the overly big eyes began pulling Nas apart, and luckily this made it less graphic to see. However, you could still see the hyper-realistic blood squirt out as they were ripping her and pulling her apart. The animation then cut to Jimmy dancing and swinging his arms to the happy, happy Halloween, 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 silver shamrock, and you could see Double D, a 3D Double D running around that was super big chinned, and then after a bit, the animation then suddenly changed again to look like an absolutely beautiful, stunning painting. And Jimmy was still dancing, and Double D with the oversized chin was popping in and out around the screen, until the chickens then suddenly swarmed in and began attacking him and massacring him, and ow, 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 it's Sarah! Jimmy tried reaching over to his oven as if it's a means of self-defense because it was turned on and super hot. But as he barely reached it, it just poured open, and you could see burnt cookies fall through the floor. He was like, "My cookies!" as he reached out one last time before being pulled in by the chickens and discarded and massacred by them. Poor Jimmy. Blood splattered and stayed on the screen as this happened. The chickens flew out to the then abysmal-looking cul-de-sac, and Rolf was just crawling around outside with his intestines out, huge. He was like, "Hey, mama," again, and he looked like an electric monster, and he tried pointing at them, and it was like, "Wilfred! Victor! May I remind you that you are forbidden from eating from Rolf's hutch, Boathatch?" But the chickens just ignored this and went on to harass Eddie, who was trying to put up a scam amongst all of this. And the chickens, they destroyed the stand that he built, while Ed smiled far off in the background watching this, squinting, so pleased. And Eddie, distraught by this, began growling as the chickens flew and flocked around amongst the mess, and he was clenching his fists and shaking and started growling, and he started talking about how much he hates birds and how they're so useless, such stupid mammals, and he then got so overwhelmingly angry with his hatred for the birds that he screamed and unleashed this purplish-red aura as the Satsuyo no Hado fully overcame and consumed Eddie as he embraced and welcomed it, and he became Violent Eddie, and Violent Eddie then started going at the chickens and attacking them, and he was actually effectively defeating some of them, and they would occasionally peck and scratch him, but he would just go like, "Ow!" at most, and mostly just shrug it off, and he just kept on attacking like he didn't care, and it didn't matter if they were gonna kill him or not. He just wanted at them and to fucking destroy them. As this devastating violence was going on, it would occasionally cut to a flash of another chicken standing there alone, not partaking in anything. Yes, this was the only other named chicken in the series aside from Gertrude. Bridget, who was only ever offhandedly mentioned once in a future episode as if a remnant of this, and we would see Bridget only staying there alone in quick cuts between the action, and at one point she had a yo-yo, and at one point she started singing about how she tastes like vegetables she don't like, and I didn't understand the meaning of this, but it would come up whenever it seemed like a chicken died, and eventually it seemed like there was just one chicken left, most likely Gertrude, with Eddie pinned on the ground and pecking at his eyes and screaming as Eddie tried to fend her off. And eventually it seemed like he did, and grabbed Bridget by the head and neck and kneed her in the neck, snapping it as she went limp, and Eddie triumphantly laying out a warrior's yell as the camera panned out and zoomed out into the sky. After a fade to black, then showed an image of Eddie looking like a giant, huge, dragon-like deity god warrior, and texted the bomb as Eddie then narrated his own ending as if it was like Onaga's cut ending in Mortal Kombat Deception. He was like, "My opponents failed to defeat me. I overcame the birds and set up my scam and get a quarter for the jawbreakers. I am the one true being." Only for Sarah's voice to then come up and start interrupting Eddie and go like, "Aw, little crybaby Eddie." And then Eddie would go like, "Shut up, Sarah." And Sarah going like, "Goo, goo." And Eddie louder being like, "Shut it, fish face, big mouth." And eventually he had lost enough control that I could see the talons of a chicken cut in through the screen and rip apart the ending image, and Eddie let out "No!" as chickens then popped off the screen and flooded it, and they looked like the normal, usual animation and were making their usual sound effects, and he kept popping off the screen almost like the episode with the bunnies and how that ended. And as this was going on, as if it was just a regular show with Ed and Eddie, it played the usual ending jiggle and Oyer style of it. And then, eventually, this got replaced with the well-known "And Ed is Boring."